Hey everyone, Mr. Souther coming at you with a video about the final exam FRQ. So this is a target question regarding the two-dimensional arrays. I chose this variety basically because it targets a two-dimensional array, but it doesn't have to, you don't have to use or you don't use the nested for loop to traverse through the array. So it's kind of, I wanted to give you an opportunity to show like, hey, do you really understand 2D arrays and can you actually take a look at this? I'll cut through this part quickly, but basically we have two classes. One is the car part, and this is where like this is simulating like you have a auto parts store for Andrew, and we're selling auto parts, and there's certain quantities of each item. So the car part class, there's basically a constructor that takes in the item name and value, and then I see get name and get value. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and highlight any of the methods that I see because there's a possibility I'm going to have to use them, right? Now the constructor for car part, I just need to like pay attention to the fact that it's an object that has a name and a value attached to it. Okay. So that's kind of cool. So then we have the car part grid, which is another class. I'm going to pay attention to like where the grid is, right? Or what's the two-dimensional or 2D array's name. But now here's what's interesting. We're going to write this method. So I'm going to go ahead and, well, actually, one more thing. We also need to check whether or not the X and Y positions are valid or not. So you kind of need to read this a couple times because it is tricky. We're going to write this max count neighbor method in a minute, and then we're going to find the average, which should be the easier part. Okay. So here's what's happening as you read through this. Remember, this is just an example. So this grid called IG, you can't assume that this is what we have, and that's all we have. This is just an example. So this 2D array could be a 5x5, could be 100x100. We don't know. They're giving us an example to help us get started. So here's the gist of max count neighbor. What it's going to do is it's going to go through, I'm going to tell it what row and what column to look at. And in case you're wondering where am I getting that from, it's right here. So public string count neighbor, it is not taking in a 2D array. It is merely taking in the row number and the column number as parameters, right? And those are integers. So if I said, hey, max neighbor count 1, 1, it's going to go ahead and take a look at injector 8, that object right there that has the name injector, the quantity of 8, and it's going to evaluate whatever's to the left and whatever's to the right and see which one has the most. And whichever one has the most, it's going to return just the name of whatever it was. Now, in this case, when I row 1, column 1, you'll notice that to the left, battery has 5, so injector 8 has more. But look at the right, tires 8, they're the same, so it's going to have to return both of those. Or either one of them, I should say. Sorry, that's what the prompt says. If I look at exhaust, right, so if I go to row 1, column 3 as my parameters or my argument, it's going to find exhaust 9. It's going to evaluate, compare it to the thing on the left, right, and then update max count. And then it's going to look to the right and realize, well, there's nothing there. So there is another method called isValid that's created, and it's going to go ahead and take a look to see like, hey, are any of the, it's going to return true or false if there's nothing there. And that's what this guy is right here. So you're going to need to use that isValid method to evaluate whether or not there is an item there or not. And it tells you explicitly right here that there's a helper method. And essentially later on, as you start the actual question, it says you must use the isValid appropriately. If you don't use it, you're going to lose a point. All right, so let's get started. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start thinking about like, what do I need? So let's just give it a little thought bubble and I'll try and type correctly here. But I'm thinking there's a couple things. I need some sort of way to evaluate with if is valid, right? And these are just my notes. You can go ahead and write that in there. It's not part of the code, right? Notes if is valid. You can write off to the side. You can also write off scratch paper that you're given. I need to use that. I need to probably, let me look and see. If you look at the first page, I highlighted some of the methods, right? So whenever I'm given a the row number and column number, I'm going to go ahead and access the array. In order to access an element in the array, I have to use get name and get value. If I don't do that, then I can't get the actual value that's there. So what I'm going to do, I'm scrolling back down, so this will save some time, right? So we need to use get name, get value, right? And presumably that has to get stored somewhere. So those are some things I'm just considering as I move along, okay? And I know that this is the grid is going to be some sort of, row column combination, right? So I'm using R for the letter they use for the parameter and C for the other letter as well. So just a couple notes there, and then I'll get started. And a good starting place always is, let's think about like creating, my mic for a sec. Go. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is we're going to need to create some sort of way to house the information for name and value, right? And max. So basically we need to find out what's the maximum count. So I'm going to go ahead and create that. Let me go ahead and use it in the coding. And I know it sucks for you, it sucks for us because we're still doing pen and paper. But I'm just using a computer just so it's easier to type and you can see this. And it's easier to look at. So I just made some sort of max counter. And where I'm going to start is I'm going to go ahead and use the grid 2D array and the row and column that I'm given right here, right? Because that's kind of important, right? Right there. Let's go and highlight all that. Because those are my parameters. I need to use those inputs. Okay, there's my mouse. And I'm going to go ahead and get that value, right? So that's going to return the value of the actual max. So if they tell me 2, row 2, column 2, it's going to go ahead and get the value and put that in max right away. We don't have to. I could use 0 as well. And then the other thing I need to return is whatever the name of the max item is. So you can call the variable whatever you want, but it has to be a string. We're going to go ahead and pre-populate it, if I can type, with the name, right? So I went ahead and did that. So now that's all set up. Now I need to basically check whether the right, so we have a couple ways to do this. What I did was I was like, okay, let's go ahead and check the item to the right and compare to whatever RC value is. How we're going to do that is, well, the first thing I need to do is I need to figure out like, is the thing to the right even exist? So I went ahead and used the isValid method. And if you go to the method earlier up, you're going to see that it needs X position and a Y position. So it needs an X and a Y. In this case, I'm going to evaluate the item to the right. So instead of X, it's going to be the same row, but instead of Y, we're going to use column and +1 there. Okay. So that's going to go ahead and evaluate that, whether or not that is a valid. So if it's going to return true, then we move on, right, to the next part. So assuming that there is something to the right, then I'm going to go ahead and check the max value and update it. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and use, and this is where we need to evaluate, hey, so I found this thing on the right to where I'm looking at, is it higher or is it not, is it a higher value or not? So I'm going to check, okay, so if that grid value for R and C+1, and I'm going to go ahead and get the value again. If it's greater than my maximum count there, right, which I declared earlier, then we're going to go ahead and update. Right, go ahead and update to that new value as C+1. And you need to give value again. Okay, so it's going to go ahead and populate that. Also, I need to update the name, right? So max item name, max item name also needs to get updated because that's really what I want to return at the end of this. So there's my if. And again, if it is valid there, if the value is greater than what's already stored in the max, then it'll trigger those ifs. Otherwise, it won't trigger anything, right? So close that if. Let's close the other if there. Okay, and then we're going to move on to whether or not the left item exists and if it's a bigger value. Okay, so to do that, I'm going to just rinse and repeat. So I'm going to use the if is valid method again, right? To see, does that row on the right, or does that element on the left, sorry, exist or not? If it does, great. So now I need to check that max value, assuming everything's good. That's another if. So lots of ifs today. So the grid RC -1 dot get value. So it's exactly the same. I'm sure there's probably a more efficient way to do it, but this works. And I checked the scoring guidelines, so I know it works. Then we're going to go ahead and update max to be that value. Just make sure it's C -1 because now we're going to go to the left. And I got to do the get value once again. Let's go ahead and update the max item to be the same thing. And get name. Close out the if. Close out the other if. And then we're going to go ahead and when all is said and done, we're going to return that max item. That's it. You could also return directly grid bracket R bracket C minus one dot get name, depending on how you did this. So that's part A. Part B hopefully was the easier part, which is to find the average. So now I need to traverse through the 2D array and find the total. And then we're going to go ahead and find the average. So these ones, I hope you guys can slay pretty well. So I'm going to set double total equals to 0.0, right? Why I'm using double is because the method itself is looking for a double, right? So if I do int, then we're going to run into some problems later because it's going to be either be truncating or an error. Okay, so I set up double total equals 0, and then we're going to go ahead and use our usual for loop, right? So row equals 0, row, run it till row is less than, in this case, we have to be careful. It's going to be the grid.length, right? Because that's the name of my array. And then we're going to do the increment at the end. And then I need to use the inner loop for the column. And so we have to be careful. So the column is going to be less than, remember, it's the grid bracket 0 dot length. So it knows that this is the column that we're working. And this is just the typical format that pretty much all of you have down by now. Now we're going to be able to traverse through the 2D array, and I need to have a running total. So we do the total plus equals, right? It's the same thing every time. And for each of the elements, I need to grab still the get value. So if I don't do get value, it will not populate the elements with the actual value. Close out that for loop, close out the other for loop, and then finally, I can go ahead and return, or I can go ahead and calculate an average if you make that, but I can also just go straight to return and do total divided by. And this is one of the things you have to pay attention to. This is a 2D array. We have rows and we have columns. So you cannot just use grid.length because that's going to give you the length of one of the rows, right? Or how many rows there are. We actually have to, because it's a table, we're going to do the same thing. So grid bracket 0 dot length times the grid dot length, right? So this is basically doing row times column. And I'm going to go ahead and put parentheses around it just to be extra safe. And then I'm going to be done if I close that out. And there's that. So I hope this helps.